Welcome to the research desk and welcome to the debate. Today we are operating under a strict analytical mandate. We have to dissect whether Moderna's oncology proof of concept will arrive before the cash clock and its collapsing COVID franchise dictate the company's ultimate strategic fate.
Right. We need an uncompromising look at the basal reality of the business here before we make any projections.
Exactly. I mean, we are evaluating a company that has experienced a roughly 90% stock fall. It plummeted from a pandemic-era peak of $497 to around $50 per share, and the market capitalization sits at roughly $20 billion right now.
Yeah. The central tension we must resolve today is unambiguous. Is this a biotech ex-superstar just living on the fumes of a vanished windfall, or is it an underpriced platform company on the verge of a second act in personalized cancer therapeutics? I'll be arguing the former, the bear case.
And I am taking the bull case. I believe they are an underpriced platform. But let's establish the indisputable baseline first.
The revenue path. It tells the story of the COVID franchise with surgical precision. And look, we cannot look away from the math. In 2020, revenue was $0.8 billion.
Right, just $0.8 billion.
Then it exploded. It went up to $18.5 billion in 2021 and peaked at $19.3 billion in 2022. But then it subsequently collapsed to roughly $6.7 billion in 2023. We must be absolutely clear on what these numbers represent.
It's not cyclical softness.
Exactly. This is not a temporary supply chain disruption or a routine fluctuation in market demand. This is a revenue cliff. The COVID narrative as an engine for indefinite high-margin growth is entirely dead. The company that once operated as a high-margin vaccine annuity is now, it's a shrinking commercial franchise, desperately attempting to fund an expensive, capital-intensive development engine.
True. However, we do agree on a crucial operational point. The company itself is not dead. They possess a validated mRNA platform in infectious disease, substantial cash resources built up during those pandemic years, and a highly serious oncology partner in Merck.
Yes, the Merck partnership is real, but that baseline forms the foundation of my skepticism.
And it forms the exact foundation of what I consider the bull case. Look, at $50 a share, with a $20 billion valuation, Moderna is firmly in its Amazon 2001 zone. The broader market is catastrophically mispricing the underlying asset because it is evaluating the company through the wrong lens.
Mispricing it? How?
Because investors are currently viewing Moderna as if its survival depends strictly on replacing the COVID vaccine with another single, universal blockbuster product. That is a fundamental analytical error. The true asset here is a highly engineered manufacturing process that creates a repeatable engine for personal oncology. The market is entirely missing the physical infrastructure, the computational algorithms, and the operating system being built underneath the wreckage of the COVID revenue cliff.
I counter that perspective directly with the bear case. Moderna is not in a zone of embryonic rebirth. It is trapped in expensive clinical limbo. Operational friction and a rapidly decaying balance sheet are going to completely overwhelm the incremental scientific progress we are seeing in the clinic.
You think the capital costs are too high?
Immense. Moving from a single mass-produced vaccine to personalized oncology requires an operational reinvention that carries unprecedented capital costs. When you look at the historical precedents of personalized medicine, this specific scenario points directly to the cautionary tale of Dendreon. Scientific novelty devoid of operational simplicity destroys equity holders. We cannot separate the elegance of the science from the brutality of the income statement.
Well, to determine which case holds merit, we need to break down the actual mechanics of the platform, beginning with the foundational nature of mRNA itself.
Sure, let's look at the biology.
We need to explain why this modality is uniquely positioned for oncology. In infectious disease, the breakthrough of mRNA was its speed and flexibility, right?
You identify the genetic sequence of a virus, you encode that instruction into synthetic messenger RNA, wrap it in a lipid nanoparticle, manufacture it rapidly, and iterate if the virus mutates.
That is the traditional vaccine model.
Exactly. The body takes that mRNA, reads the instruction, and builds a harmless piece of the virus, an antigen, to train the immune system. But when we transition to oncology, specifically to individualized neoantigen vaccines. Those attributes of speed and flexibility are not merely incidental benefits. They are the entire point. Because cancer is not a static, universal virus. It is a highly mutated, highly individualized disease.
Precisely. A patient-specific cancer vaccine only functions commercially and clinically if your operational system can move from tumor sequencing to product design to manufacturing with unprecedented speed. Let us walk through how this actually works for a patient. A surgeon removes a tumor. That tumor tissue is sequenced digitally to identify the specific genetic mutations that are unique to that single patient's cancer.
These mutations create abnormal proteins called neoantigens.
Yes, and Moderna uses a proprietary algorithm to select up to 34 of the most promising neoantigens, the ones most likely to trigger a strong immune response. They encode those 34 specific instructions into a single strand of mRNA, manufacture that bespoke strand, and inject it back into the patient.
And the patient's body does the rest.
The patient's own body reads the mRNA, produces those 34 mutant proteins, and trains their T cells to hunt down any remaining cancer cells hiding in the body. Traditional drug development models structurally fail here. You cannot pull this off the shelf. Moderna is merging mRNA with digital tumor sequencing and a highly engineered manufacturing process to create a repeatable engine.
Okay, but what about the partnership validation?
Furthermore, Merck's involvement is the ultimate historical validation case. They are partnering their drug, Keytruda, which is the leading checkpoint inhibitor in the world, with Moderna's V930 vaccine. Merck is not an organization that underwrites fantasy. They are validating this platform with serious capital and an immense clinical trial commitments.
Merck's validation is notable, I will give you that. And Keytruda is undeniably a foundational asset in modern oncology. But validation from a partner does not guarantee clinical triumph or commercial viability. We must evaluate the actual clinical evidence driving this optimism. What does the data actually tell us, and what does it obscure?
The clinical evidence is exactly what crosses the Rubicon from theoretical platform rhetoric to hard human evidence. Let us look at the data in the adjuvant high-risk melanoma setting.
Let's define adjuvant for the audience, just for clarity.
Good idea. Adjuvant refers to treatment given after the primary treatment, usually surgery, to lower the risk that the cancer will return. These are patients who have had their melanoma tumor surgically removed, but they are at a very high risk of the cancer coming back. In this setting, the V930 and Keytruda combination generated a hazard ratio around 0.65 for recurrence-free survival when compared to Keytruda alone.
And we need to translate that metric precisely. A hazard ratio is a measure of relative risk over time.
Correct. A hazard ratio of 1.0 means there is no difference between the treatment group and the control group. A hazard ratio around 0.65 means that at any given point in time, the patients receiving the Moderna vaccine plus Keytruda had a 35% lower risk of their cancer returning compared to the patients receiving just Keytruda.
Which sounds impressive on the surface.
It is profound. Let me contextualize the magnitude of these metrics over a longer horizon. We are looking at a 48% reduction in the risk of recurrence or death at 2.5 years.
Wow.
Even more profoundly, the data demonstrates a 62% reduction in distant metastases or death.
Right, distant metastases, meaning the cancer has spread from the original site to distant organs, the lungs, the brain, the liver.
Exactly, which is usually the fatal threshold in melanoma. A 62% reduction in that specific outcome is massive. These numbers do not signify a universal cure for all cancers, but they firmly, statistically establish that the personalized mRNA approach is biologically active and clinically relevant in human beings.
I will grant the biological activity. A hazard ratio of 0.65 in one specific setting is indeed impressive for a single asset, but I must push back on the broader extrapolation here.
How so?
How does a single positive signal in melanoma justify the premium of an entire platform when oncology attrition rates are so historically unforgiving? You are pointing to one trial and attempting to underwrite an entire new era of medicine.
It justifies the premium because new therapeutic platforms historically look underwhelming, overcomplicated, and narrowly applicable right before they become overwhelmingly obvious. To understand Moderna's current $20 billion market capitalization, we must narrate the Amazon 2001 story in full, because the psychological dynamics of the market are identical.
The classic tech analogy. Let's hear it.
Let us go back to the fallout of the dot-com bubble. Amazon's stock fell precipitously from roughly $107 to $7. The market capitalization evaporated. At $7 a share, the broader market treated Amazon strictly as a capital-consuming entity tied to a dead internet bubble narrative. The Wall Street consensus was that selling books and CDs online was a low-margin commodity business that would inevitably be crushed by traditional retailers.
Because they were looking exclusively at the near-term income statement. They saw immense logistical cost and negative margins.
Precisely. The strategist's insight that the market entirely missed was that the infrastructure, the customer behavior patterns, and the logistical operating system being built underneath the immediate wreckage were far more valuable than the collapsing near-term optics suggested. The market was fixated on the immediate profit and loss statement and completely missed the platform.
They missed AWS, basically.
They missed the massive distribution centers being strategically placed. They missed the foundational architecture of what would become Amazon Web Services. They missed the one-click purchasing patents. The direct parallel to Moderna is striking. At $50 a share, the market is fixated on the collapsing COVID revenue, the $19.3 billion dropping to roughly $6.7 billion, and is completely underappreciating a platform capable of repeatedly generating targeted therapeutics.
But tech is not biology.
Then, let us look at the Rituxan story to understand the trajectory of novel modalities in medicine. In the late 1990s, monoclonal antibodies faced immense skepticism.
True. The skepticism was rooted in the sheer difficulty of manufacturing them at scale.
Exactly. Critics focused strictly on the manufacturing complexity, the exorbitant costs of mammalian cell culture, and the uncertain durability of the clinical responses. The consensus was that antibodies were too fragile, too difficult to produce, and too likely to trigger severe immune reactions to ever be commercially viable.
And yet, Rituxan succeeded.
Yet Rituxan overcame these exact operational hurdles to become a foundational oncology therapy for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It proved that a questioned, highly complex modality can evolve into a category-defining platform. Checkpoint inhibitors, like Merck's Keytruda, faced the exact same early skepticism regarding narrow applicability and extreme cost before they ended up dominating modern oncology. Moderna is following this exact historical trajectory. The complexity of the present is masking the ubiquity of the future.
Look, that historical framing is rhetorically powerful. Comparing any distressed asset to Amazon in 2001 is the oldest defensive maneuver in growth investing. But it completely ignores the brutal base rates of the biotechnology industry.
The base rates are just averages, though.
We are not talking about scaling server space or optimizing supply chain logistics for consumer goods. We are talking about human biology, which is infinitely more hostile to engineering assumptions. We must systematically dismantle this platform optimism using the actual probabilities of success. In oncology, the reported overall probability of success from phase 1 clinical trials to FDA approval is a devastating 3.4%.
Wait, let us pause on that number. You are citing a 3.4% success rate. Are you genuinely suggesting that out of every 100 experimental cancer drugs that enter human testing, roughly 96 of them fail completely?
I am citing the 3.4% because market memory is notoriously short and biotechnology attrition is unforgiving. Yes, historically, 96.6% of oncology assets fail. The phase-specific attrition rates are equally brutal, and we need to understand where the bodies are buried.
Break those down for us.
We see a 13.8% success rate from phase 1. If a drug survives that, it enters the valley of death. Phase 2. We see a 26.6% success rate from phase 2. And even if a drug makes it all the way to a massive, expensive phase 3 trial, we still only see a 55.4% success rate.
But V930 already has a positive signal in phase 2.
A positive signal in a phase 2 melanoma trial, which is what Moderna has with V930, is interesting science. But it is not an investable platform franchise until it survives multiple rounds of biological and statistical attrition. You cannot assign a $20 billion platform valuation to a 26.6% probability.
But those base rates include hundreds of traditional small molecules and conventional chemotherapies that fail due to off-target toxicity. Moderna is using targeted mRNA based on the patient's exact genetic code. The mechanism is entirely different.
The mechanism is different, but the burden of proof remains identical. Furthermore, I must deeply question the Keytruda crutch here.
The Keytruda crutch?
Yes. When we look at that 48% reduction in recurrence or death, or the 62% reduction in distant metastasis, we must ask a critical mechanistic question. How much of that benefit belongs uniquely to Moderna's individualized vaccine, and how much is simply Merck's checkpoint blockade backbone doing the heavy lifting?
Well, we need to explain how Keytruda works to address that properly.
Keytruda is a PD-1 inhibitor. In simple terms, cancer cells often wear a protein disguise, a do-not-eat-me signal, that shuts down the body's T cells. Keytruda blocks that signal. It takes the brakes off the immune system, allowing the T cells to attack the cancer. It is a phenomenally active drug in melanoma all on its own. It is the standard of care.
Right?
So, when Moderna tests its vaccine plus Keytruda against Keytruda alone, we must be ruthlessly skeptical about the marginal benefit. If the immune system is already unleashed by Keytruda, is the Moderna vaccine truly steering those T cells effectively? Or are we just seeing a slight combinatorial enhancement that will fade in larger patient populations?
If the vaccine were contributing zero marginal benefit, we would not see a hazard ratio of 0.65 when compared against Keytruda alone. The trial was designed specifically to isolate the effect of the vaccine.
But the synergy might be overstated.
Both groups received Keytruda. Only one group received the bespoke mRNA vaccine. The statistical separation, the 62% drop in metastasis, is driven entirely by the addition of the neoantigen vaccine, teaching the newly unleashed T cells exactly what to target. Keytruda removes the brakes, yes, but the Moderna vaccine provides the GPS coordinates.
Even conceding the biological activity and the GPS analogy, we must confront the operational nightmare of personalized medicine. This is where your Amazon analogy completely collapses.
Because of logistics?
Yes. Personalized neoantigen vaccines are not software. You cannot duplicate them with zero marginal cost. Each individual patient's tumor must be surgically biopsied, transported securely, genetically sequenced, interpreted by an algorithm, encoded into a bespoke mRNA sequence, manufactured in a sterile environment, quality checked to exact FDA standards, and delivered back to the clinic within a rigid clinical window of roughly 30 to 45 days.
It is a tight window, yes.
If there is a delay, the cancer spreads and the patient becomes ineligible or dies. This operational complexity leads us directly to the full story of Dendreon and its therapy Provenge.
Ah, the Dendreon parallel. It is frequently cited by skeptics, but we need to detail exactly what happened to understand why it is fundamentally different.
We need to detail it because it is the ultimate warning about the intersection of biology and logistics. In 2010, the FDA approved Provenge for advanced prostate cancer. It was universally celebrated as a massive breakthrough in personalized immunotherapy.
And it had real clinical benefit.
It did. The clinical benefit was real and statistically significant. It demonstrated roughly a 4.1-month median overall survival benefit. It was hailed as the future of oncology, but what followed the scientific triumph was a complete operational collapse. The therapy required a complex leukapheresis process.
We must clarify what leukapheresis entails for the patient, because it highlights the physical friction you're talking about.
Leukapheresis is an exhausting physical procedure. A patient must sit in a clinic for hours, attached to a machine that filters their blood, separates out the white blood cells, and returns the red blood cells to their body.
Sounds intense.
It is. And those extracted live white blood cells then had to be placed in specialized temperature-controlled containers and physically flown across the country to a Dendreon manufacturing facility. At the facility, the cells were cultured with a specific fusion protein to activate them against prostate cancer. Then, those live activated cells had to be flown back across the country to the patient and infused before the cells died.
And they had to do this multiple times?
This process had to be repeated 3 separate times for a single course of treatment. The high costs, roughly $93,000 in 2010, combined with extreme manufacturing complexity, rigid timing, and awkward logistical realities completely crushed physician uptake.
Clinics had to take on a lot of financial risk?
Clinics had to buy the drug up front and navigate a labyrinth of Medicare reimbursement uncertainty, hoping they would be paid back. By 2014, just 4 years after a celebrated FDA approval, Dendreon filed for bankruptcy. The central lesson of Dendreon is absolute and unforgiving. Scientific novelty without operational simplicity destroys equity holders. Moderna faces an identical operational burden with its bespoke mRNA manufacturing.
I see why you draw that parallel. The logistical friction of personalized medicine is definitely the primary risk factor, but I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the magnitude of the clinical data.
How does magnitude solve logistics?
If Dendreon's failure was fundamentally driven by a lack of magnitude in clinical benefit, offering just an incremental 4.1 months of median overall survival, doesn't Moderna's 62% reduction in distant metastasis suggest they have already cleared the efficacy threshold that doomed Provenge?
That's quite a leap.
You are comparing a treatment that gave end-stage patients an extra 120 days of life to a treatment that prevents the cancer from metastasizing in the first place. A 62% reduction in distant metastasis alters the entire trajectory of the disease and potentially represents a functional cure for a subset of patients, whereas 4.1 months is merely a marginal extension of end-stage life. If the clinical benefit is overwhelming, the healthcare system will adapt to the logistics.
The magnitude of the benefit is superior in the Moderna data, yes, but a superior clinical outcome does not erase the systemic financial risk currently baked into the company structure. Which brings us to another critical historical precedent, the Gilead hepatitis C analogy.
You are referring to the Sovaldi and Harvoni era.
Exactly. We must analyze what happens to a company that experiences a massive, unrepeatable financial windfall. In the mid-2010s, Gilead Sciences launched Sovaldi and Harvoni, which were literal cures for hepatitis C. They generated extraordinary, unprecedented profits. It was a massive financial windfall that broke records for pharmaceutical launches.
Record-breaking, absolutely.
But because the drugs actually cured the patients, the addressable market shrank rapidly. Once that specific patient pool was cured and the windfall faded, the market never restored the narrative premium to Gilead's stock. It left Gilead to trade permanently as a lower multiple biotech company, despite the firm remaining highly profitable and cash generative.
Even though they were highly profitable.
Exactly. Moderna is facing the exact same psychological penalty. They experienced an unprecedented windfall from the COVID-19 vaccine. That patient pool, at least in terms of government-mandated high-margin global mass vaccination, is gone. Moderna may survive as a viable company, but the market may never assign it the premium valuation of its $497 pandemic peak.
I would argue that curing hepatitis C and developing a repeatable platform for personalized cancer vaccines are strategically different. Gilead cured a static virus. Moderna is building an engine to address multiple different indications.
But the financial mechanics of the transition are what matter today. We must apply Aswath Damodaran's corporate lifecycle framework to Moderna's current financials. Damodaran, a foundational voice in valuation, points out that you evaluate a company in transition by looking at its operating walls.
And you think Moderna's walls are crumbling?
Currently, 3 of the 4 operating walls for Moderna are flashing bright red. We are looking at sharply declining revenue moving from $19.3 billion to roughly $6.7 billion. We are looking at deeply negative operating margins. And crucially, we are looking at a deeply negative return on invested capital, or ROIC.
We should define ROIC clearly for the analysis.
It is essentially a measure of efficiency. It asks, for every dollar of capital a company invests in its business, into research, into factories, into equipment, how much cash profit does it generate in return?
Correct. And right now, Moderna's ROIC is deeply negative. They're pouring billions into the oncology platform, and it is yielding zero commercial revenue today. This is a company currently consuming value, not compounding it.
They are investing in the future. Furthermore, they recently took on a $1.5 billion loan. In a high-interest rate environment, for a company that generated nearly $20 billion in revenue just 2 years ago, I view this loan not as a sign of strength, but as a glaring warning about their forward cash burn and the deteriorating quality of their financial runway. They are racing against a ticking clock. The cash from the COVID years is finite, and the oncology pipeline is capital ravenous.
To bridge our perspectives on this transition and to understand whether they can beat that ticking clock, we need to dissect the manufacturing analogies that define this specific strategic pivot. The friction you are highlighting is real, but it is an engineering problem, not a biological impossibility.
The most accurate operational analogy for what Moderna is attempting is the transition from a fast food chain to a Michelin-starred kitchen.
Oh, that's an interesting way to frame it. It highlights the severe operational whiplash the organization is currently experiencing. Let us look at their operations during the COVID pandemic. Moderna functioned like a highly efficient industrial fast food chain. They executed extreme industrial repetition. They produced a single standardized product, mRNA 1273, at massive global volume.
Filling millions of identical vials with the exact same liquid.
Exactly. The supply chain was complex, but it was uniform. Now, they must completely transform their corporate culture, their quality assurance protocols, and their physical infrastructure to become a Michelin-starred kitchen.
Meaning they must shift from mass production to mass customization.
Precisely. They must produce bespoke, batch-of-one therapies at commercial volumes. Every single patient requires a custom order. The tumor is unique. The genetic sequence is unique. The mRNA strand is unique. It requires unique ingredients, tailored preparation, and precise delivery timing.
Right, there is no pulling it off the shelf.
If a batch fails quality control, you cannot just pull another vial off the shelf. You have to start the manufacturing process over, and the patient may not have the time to wait. Investors are modeling this transition as if the same factory simply swaps out a recipe. In reality, it is an entirely different business model wearing the same technological label. The quality control alone for a batch-of-one therapy is a logistical nightmare that destroys margins.
I see the structural friction in the Michelin-starred kitchen analogy, but I counter that with the arsenal of democracy analogy.
The WWI analogy?
Yes. The transition is profound, but it is not historically unprecedented in industrial engineering. Moving from standard pandemic vaccines to decentralized microfactory networks capable of bespoke production is fundamentally a retooling challenge. It has direct historical precedent in wartime mass production. During World War II, the United States did not simply rely on existing munitions factories. It mastered the art of industrial learning. The nation retooled standard civilian production lines into highly specialized rapid output manufacturing hubs for complex machinery.
But both of these analogies, whether you view it as a Michelin kitchen or an arsenal of democracy, rest entirely on one critical wildcard: whether Moderna can actually learn and scale these processes before the balance sheet collapses and the $1.5 billion loan becomes a distressed liability.
Exactly. This brings us to the core of the bull thesis, the hidden metric that the broader market is entirely missing.
Which is?
The core investment thesis is not just about whether V930 becomes a singular blockbuster drug for melanoma. It is about whether Moderna possesses a compressed design, manufacture, learn cycle. This is the industrial learning parallel I want to expand upon, specifically Henry Ford's shift from manufacturing standard automobiles to producing B-24 bombers during the Second World War at the Willow Run facility.
Ford faced immense skepticism because building a bomber with over 1 million parts is fundamentally different from building a Model T.
And the early days of Willow Run were plagued by delays,
operational friction, and immense criticism. But the strategic advantage Ford brought to the war effort was not simply the physical footprint of the massive factory. The core advantage was system learning.
Standardizing processes to accelerate throughput.
Exactly. They systematically broke down highly complex aerospace engineering processes, standardized them where possible, trained labor rapidly, and accelerated throughput at an unprecedented scale. They went from building a handful of planes a month to eventually producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. If Moderna can apply that exact type of system learning to personalized medicine, if they can turn tumor sequencing into individualized therapeutic design with continuously shrinking cycle times and declining unit costs, they achieve a monumental operational moat. This operational learning loop is where the massive valuation asymmetry exists.
And how does that relate to the base rates we discussed earlier?
If they achieve this system learning, they escape the gravity of that brutal 3.4% base rate you cited, because they are no longer blindly testing distinct chemical compounds and hoping for a biological hit. They are using a deterministic platform. The advantage comes from the speed at which the entire organization improves after every single patient they treat.
So the process gets cheaper and faster over time.
Exactly. The algorithm gets smarter at selecting neoantigens, the manufacturing time drops from 45 days to 30 days to 14 days, the quality control becomes automated. That is why the $20 billion valuation is justified. You are buying the learning machine, not just the melanoma data.
Look, system learning and rapid iteration are fantastic concepts for a graduate-level MBA case study on disruptive innovation. But we are operating at the research desk, and we are looking at severely negative margins today. Your thesis relies on infinite patience from the capital markets.
Markets can be patient for the right narrative.
How long can a management team logically finance a theoretical learning loop when the legacy COVID revenue is cratering by tens of billions of dollars? A learning loop requires immense capital expenditure, building new factories, hiring specialized bioengineers, running massive clinical trials.
It is an investment phase.
When your return on invested capital is deeply negative, every iteration of that loop destroys shareholder value in the near term. You are asking investors to endure massive dilution and margin compression on the promise that the Willow Run bomber factory eventually hits its stride. If the cash clock runs out before the learning loop is perfected, the equity goes to zero, regardless of how elegant the science is.
Well, we have arrived at the synthesis of our two frameworks, where the fundamental tension of the stock price currently resides. We must acknowledge the phase transition Moderna is currently undergoing. The company is trapped in the middle of two entirely different paradigms.
Correct. It is not a dead narrative, despite the COVID collapse, and it is not in a confirmed embryonic rebirth, despite the compelling melanoma data. It is a high optionality company trapped in extremely expensive clinical limbo.
So why do you need to see to change your mind?
For this stock to become investable at scale for institutions, we must demand a concrete operational scoreboard. The narrative of the platform is insufficient. We need empirical financial proof. The goal is to turn Aswath Damodaran's three red walls, the declining revenue, the negative operating margins, and the negative ROIC, to yellow and eventually to green. The science must heal the income statement. We need to see an absolute deceleration in the revenue decline and a demonstrable quarter-over-quarter improvement in operating margins, driven by the scaling of the oncology platform.
For healing, that income statement rests on an ultimate clinical threshold. The market needs an undeniably de-risking event. For a broad market reassessment to occur, for the stock to break out of this $50 range, we need to see a specific milestone. We need a phase 3 melanoma result where the hazard ratio falls firmly below 0.5.
Why 0.85 specifically?
Because a hazard ratio of 0.65 in a phase 2 trial is highly encouraging, but in a larger phase 3 trial, efficacy often regresses to the mean. A hazard ratio below 0.5 would represent a halving of the risk of recurrence, which is so statistically profound that it overcomes any skepticism about the checkpoint inhibitor doing all the heavy lifting. Furthermore, this hazard ratio must be combined with hard, peer-reviewed evidence of overall survival benefit, not merely recurrence-free survival.
Meaning patients are actually living significantly longer, not just going longer without a detectable tumor.
Exactly. Recurrence-free survival is a surrogate endpoint, Overall survival is the ultimate gold standard in oncology. Alongside that clinical data, we need definitive proof of manufacturing scalability and favorable unit economics in their quarterly reports. Can they produce this therapy with a gross margin that supports a viable business? Moderna is effectively a hybrid of Amazon's massive platform optionality from 2001 and Gilead's severe re-rating risk post-hepatitis C.
Given that specific hybrid nature, we must pivot from theoretical analysis to strict portfolio application. As a strategist, my allocation rules for an asset with this profile are rigid and uncompromising. You must treat Moderna as a highly speculative option, not a core biotechnology holding. A strict 1% to 3% portfolio allocation is appropriate.
I agree, keep it small.
This constrained size prevents the inevitable dilution or the timeline slippage of the manufacturing build-out from permanently impairing a broader portfolio. You are capping your downside while retaining exposure to the platform upside.
I entirely agree on the strict sizing parameters, and I will add a crucial mandate for any analyst reviewing this company. There can be absolutely no COVID nostalgia in your underwriting. Projecting a return to the $18.5 billion or $19.3 billion revenue years based on an updated seasonal respiratory vaccine is a fundamental analytical error.
The COVID revenue engine is permanently broken.
It will not return to pandemic levels. Your model must be based strictly on post-peak reality, the baseline cash position, and the heavily discounted future value of the oncology platform.
We must also manage this position with tactical volatility in mind. The mechanics of trading this equity require extreme psychological discipline.
How so?
You must trim positions into euphoric spikes driven by early-stage press releases or cyclical pandemic news, unless those spikes are backed by hard, peer-reviewed overall survival data from phase 3 trials. Conversely, you should only add to the position on definitive clinical de-risking events or panic-driven market dislocations, where the market cap dips below the intrinsic value of their cash and validated infectious disease pipeline.
And you pair it with safer bets?
Exactly. Furthermore, to construct a sound portfolio, you must pair this asymmetric innovation risk with high-quality, proven biotechnology or pharmaceutical companies that generate massive, reliable cash flows today.
Well, to summarize the strategic reality we have mapped out today, Moderna is caught in the absolute most dangerous zone of the corporate narrative cycle. The initial miracle business, the pandemic vaccine, has faded, and the second act, the personalized oncology engine, has not yet been definitively proven at commercial scale.
That's the core tension.
The oncology pivot backed by Merck and the phase 2 melanoma data is real enough to keep the equity alive and to logically justify the current $20 billion market capitalization, but it is not yet robust enough to command institutional trust until concrete financial traction and scalable unit economics arrive. We are witnessing a monumental, unprecedented transition from a single product mass manufacturer to a pioneer of individualized therapeutics. And the immense operational friction of that transition is currently defining the stock price.
Ultimately, the entire analysis hinges on the physical reality of their manufacturing infrastructure. As we conclude this briefing, I leave you with this final defining insight, quoting exactly from the structural analysis. The bull case lives or dies on one proposition. Moderna is not trying to replace one blockbuster with another. It is trying to prove a production system for personalized medicine. This is the research desk officially signing off.